Hello, my name is Brad Peak, and this is a tutorial on how to make a uh, custom logo design and transfer it from 2D to 3D. Um, so, as this is supposed to be a more basic tutorial, um, what I'm doing is that I'm going to make it a little more simple than if you want a very high quality or high definition model. I'm going to keep it a little more simple just to kind of get more people used to the idea of playing around with a 3D modeling program to make something like this. So, as such, the end product will not be incredibly high quality um, in terms of the number of like polygons or the number of angles and stuff like that. It's going to be a little bit more simplified. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and start. This is a program called Blender, and this is what a lot of people do use for a little bit more hobby oriented um, 3D modeling. It is used for some professional projects, but it's also one that's a little bit easier to get into than just about anything else you're going to find. Um, so I'm going to go through a couple basic um, modeling processes. First, what we're going to do is I'm going to explain this right here. This area right here is what's called the 3D view. And this is where the actual modeling takes place. This is where the actual model will be. This over here is the UV viewer. And this is where our textures will be. And the textures are what gives color and a little bit more definition to the model. For right now, for this project, we're only going to be using these two. You can add additional windows simply by dragging from this little area right here and dragging it up. You can get rid of them by dragging them down. There's a lot more that you can do here. But for what we're doing, we just need these two windows. And we'll need this area up here, which is, if you've ever used Photoshop, this is almost like the layer that you'll be working on, the layer list. But let's go ahead and get started then. What we're going to do, because we're going to try to do everything from scratch without downloading models pre-made, anything like that, is first we're going to add our first big model. Another word for that would be mesh. And for this, because the idea is going to be kind of more like a soccer logo where it looks like a shield, and then it's going to be a pencil added on. The shield is going to look like a piece of paper, and then we're going to have the word tech writing on top of it, almost like a logo for the class. So by adding the cube, this would be our first real model that we're using. If you hit tab while your mouse is in either of these windows, this will go between the different modes there are, which for our purposes today, we'll be using object mode and edit mode. Object mode kind of lets you look at it in general, do some general movements. Edit mode is where we'll actually be able to modify in a little bit better detail the mesh, the object. So if you hit A, it will either select all or deselect all. You can hit C and select different areas as you need it. You could hit B and just box it. For however you like. Those are the three main ways of selecting these little things, which are called vertexes. And those are going to be the main gripping points to be working with. So for right now, since we want to edit the entire mesh, we'll hit A, select everything. If you hit S, that changes size. If you want to change only one dimension, height, width, or length, you hit the appropriate button, which is the X axis, the y-axis, or the z-axis. So for this, we're going to want the x-axis. We don't want it paper thin. We do want some definition. And then S, so we can make it a little bit bigger everywhere. Now to make it a little more shield-like, we're going to need a couple more vertexes than these. So with everything highlighted, hit spacebar, and this is going to be a list of a lot of different translations and transitions and modifications that you can make. For our purposes, we want subdivide. And you can type it in and it's kind of a quick action. Hit that and you'll see we got more verts to play with. You're going to want to do that a couple times, and if you hit spacebar again, it'll keep it in memory. And it might start to look a little intimidating right here. But given that our shape is going to be a little more simple, it really kind of isn't. So, we'll want to select, we'll try about right here. And given that, like I said, we're not going to be going for a super high definition, it's going to look a little blocky. But again, as a starter project, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to move these more towards the edge and make an edge out of this corner. If you hit G, you can move anything that you have highlighted. And if you want to move it in a certain direction, again, X, Y, Z axis. So I believe on this one we want Y. And then Z. And then if you hit G, you can kind of free move it, so you get a little bit more control. Although you got to make sure everything still lines up for how you want it. Now, for this, we're going to deselect the first row of verts. Now with the second row, and it should be a little more plain. It should be somewhat plain to what we're doing. We're going to try to scrunch this up, and there's other ways to do this. But for a beginner, this will probably be the cleanest way to do it. Again, it's going to look a little rough. And making sure we don't get too far off of center. And that's one of the main reasons why I like using the axis buttons. Because some of that I did do freehand, just to show you what kind of error could come from that. And now it's going to take a little bit more effort to kind of line everything up and make it look nice. Make sure everything is moved. There we go. Then as things get put into place, deselect them. And of course, as with most programs, always trust to Control Z if you need to undo something. It can only go back a certain number of times, but in general, unless it's something way back, you'll be fine. Of course, just like anything else, save regularly, and you'll avoid a lot of those problems. So if you have something small like that, what you just saw, and you might not see that you still have it highlighted, again, A button, select or deselect everything. Now, one thing to remember, as a 3D object, it does have a back and a front. So you can kind of see this little bit right here wasn't caught by the initial grab. Again, we can just kind of move it into position as we need it. If we really wanted to fine tune it, then obviously we would get in here, go bit by bit, you could say. Line everything up like this. And that's kind of what these lines are useful for, is making sure everything's lined up, everything is where you want it exactly. And as you can see, like I said, especially like right through here, it does look a little bumpy, it doesn't look smooth. That's because we're kind of doing it, like I said, as a large cluster instead of fine-tuning it. We don't want to leave any too many large, obvious bumps. But again, as a tutorial project, as an instruction manual, we don't necessarily need to make it look absolutely perfect. Now, you can see like right there, these two, you can kind of tell where they go by the lines on them. You can kind of tell, you can move them around to see where they would go. But for how this is turning out, they shouldn't actually be visible for the most part. This poking out, it might be noticeable, so we'll move that back. But again, just for as a rough thing, we'll just leave it like that. And then, of course, we're going to do the same thing to this side. You're going to want to line them up so you can get both sides a little bit easier. Now, another thing to notice is that okay, so just so that doesn't get worse, we're going to deselect that. And again, just kind of trying to line it up and make it look halfway decent. We'll fix that in a moment. If you do hit, like, let's say I wanted to move it Y, but I hit X by accident, I can just hit Y and it just instantly switches over. So you don't need to worry necessarily about it being too careful. Now this one I'm not going to do it freehand at all, because I think it should turn out nicer even if we had to make a little bit of adjustment afterward, just to show you like the difference between the two. To me, you always learn more through error than you do through victory. So showing these off shouldn't be too big of a sin. So like right there, I can just switch between Z and X and Y. These two I didn't necessarily want to deselect just yet. And as you see, let's see, this one I'll go here. And since this is a single row, we'll just kind of move in and there we go. And you can see it does still look a little rough. It's not perfect. Again, if you really wanted to fine tune it, it's not too difficult to. But even without, you can see the difference between how relatively smooth this side looks to this side. So yeah, you can freehand it. It's not necessarily a great idea. But then you can also fine tune it. Like this doesn't look great, even with our fine tuning. So set that there. It's going to look a little bit more solid. This one we had selected by accident, so we're just going to kind of move these back into a little bit of a better position. One thing to remember is that even though this is a 3D model in the 3D modeling program, when you're working with something like this, it's still a 2D experience to the eyes, we'll say. So like, yeah, we're moving stuff up and down and left and right, but in a 3D way. You know, we're using height and length and width. But in the computer's eye and in the way you move your mouse, it is still like a 2D plane. So freehand, that's really why the freehand side looks that much worse than the non-freehand side, because you can kind of control the 3D model in a 2D manner. Now you might notice that has happened a couple times with the with something disappearing. That's another button you can use. We're not really using it for this, but it is good to know what it is and what it does. It's called hide. It's the H button. Because a lot of what we can do does involve like the F button. If you hit the H button by accident, which is right next to it, and you see a part of your model disappear, especially starting out, it can be really kind of horrifying. If you just trying to hit the G button, trying to move, and you might think, oh no, there goes a whole lot of work, but no, really all you have to do is hit Control H and it should fix itself. So, like I said, I'm going to kind of leave that one looking rough just to show you, again, kind of the difference even in the final product. One thing we are going to do is we're going to give this a little bit of depth. Again, kind of like a shield would have. So we're going to select all the inside ones. You will kind of have to go in and out of the capture mode every once in a while just to move the camera around, which you do with the middle click button. We are going to want to leave the outer layer of the inside unselected, and you'll see why in a moment. We'll check the other side. Now, when you're working with one side, you can bleed through on your grabs to the other side. So that's something you do have to kind of be noticeable about. More often than not, you will want to grab both sides. But there are times when you won't want to grab both sides, or there's something behind it that you don't want to touch. That's just something to stay a little bit mindful of. So, now that we just about have everything we want selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit size, X. And what that does is, as you can see, it kind of sandwiches it together a little bit more, just like we did originally with the box when it first started. But that's going to give it some depth, which it's a little hard to tell right now. And again, down here, it doesn't look great. That's because of the way that we smooth these out kind of quick. And it's also because if we wanted this to make this look perfect, we would want to subdivide this more. But again, as an instructional video, we don't necessarily want to make it make something that's too complicated, too scary looking. So yeah, it's not looking perfect down there. But if you did want it to look perfect, then obviously you would work with the pixels a little bit more, work with the vertexes a little bit more, smooth everything out, have a higher number of vertexes. But again, even with just this, you can tell that one side was way better done than the other side. So, now, like I said, we're going to have this look like a sheet of paper, and this does look uneven. Again, a difference between freehanding and not freehanding. We said we wanted this to look like a piece of paper that was being written on, and we also wanted a pencil. So what we're going to do, add another object. This one's going to be a cylinder. That's going to be very pencil-like in the first place. I'm going to size it X and then Y. Try to keep it pretty cylindrical still. Don't want to look too thick, but maybe that should be good for right now. And then size it up with Z. And we're going to want to subdivide this one too. Just a couple times to hopefully make it look a little more pencil-like. Now we could subdivide it more again to make it look a little bit more angular, like a traditional pencil is, where it has 6 or 7 different sides. Again, for this, we want it to be a little bit more simple. And a lot of the work that we're going to do to make this look like a pencil will actually be in the textures, in the coloring. So for this, we do want the pencil to come to a point. So again, deselect everything. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these 2 circles down. I'm going to want this one down here too. Now, that might be a little bit too close together. Let's go up. And go up. So, I like to work on something like this from the bottom up, from the point up. Select everything, size, and just bring it in as far as you can. So, now on this one, obviously you're not going to bring it as far as you can, but you're going to size it until it looks a little bit wider. And you can move it up and down to kind of make it look a little bit more simple. On this one, I think I will move up a little bit more again, because I want this to look like a little bit of a finer point. Let's see, move it up. Again, not perfect. Should be good though. And from here, we can kind of size it a little bit better for a proportion. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it. R for rotate. A lot of these are very simple. You just got to remember the first word or first letter of the word, and you'll be halfway there. Again, as you can see, I can spin my mouse several different ways, and it just kind of spins. This one also does the X, Y, Z. So what we're going to do, X, and then Y. And then if you hit G, you grab it. Again, you can X, Y, Z this, but this one's a little bit better to do freehand generally. And we want it to look like it's writing, but we don't want it to poke too far out to where it makes the logo look a little obnoxious. So one thing you can do with the camera is if you hit Control F, you can kind of, and you might have seen me do this a couple times, but for something like this where you're trying to put something into position, it's where it really comes into handy. If you hit Control F, you can kind of free roam, and then when you want to exit, you just click. So that looks like it could work. Rotate a little bit more. And there. So, again, something that can be made a lot more complicated, but for something like this, simple compared to what we had to do for the shield. Made that look easy. So what we're going to want to do is now we're going to want to start worrying about the coloring, making it look a little bit more like a pencil, stuff like that. So for this is where this window comes into play. We want to select everything, hit U, unwrap. Now, given that it's coming out like this, that's not great for how we're going to want to do this. So we're going to want to hit U, unwrap, and then project from view. As you can see, now it looks over here like it does over here. And for our purposes, it's going to be a little bit better to rotate that to look like that. Back over here. We're going to want to do the same thing. Again, doesn't look great. So, project from view. And it's always going to look exactly like this here. So if we did it like this, it's going to look like that. But we're going to want it to look like this. Now, let's go over to our photo editing program, which I use paint.net. I find it to be a little bit simpler, and it's also free, which is one of the main things we want to do with this is kind of keep it free. So what we're going to do is we're going to make textures by ourselves. Usually you will not want there to be a plain white background because anything that will bleed through will be on that. If it's on a backward, no color, transparent background, then it'll look a little bit better. So we're going to want pencil orange. And we're going to want, let's see, we'll go with that for right now. And then just below it, we're going to want the wood. And then just below that, we're going to want the lead. Up top, we will want the silver. Needs to be a little bit lighter. And then above that, the eraser top. And you can see I'm kind of doing it haphazardly. It'll make sense once we get back to the other program. For the shield, that will be a little bit more important to a degree. So for the outside of the shield, I kind of want something a little bit more faux gold. Or maybe something just generally more brown. Actually, no, we'll do... Yeah, let's actually just do plain black, because that's going to contrast with the inside a little bit more. So for this, just make a big mess of black in the shape, kind of the shape that we want. And then on the inside, since we want it to look like a piece of paper, is that, and then we'll do some pink lines. And for this, obviously you can just copy and paste. I did move these to their own separate layer just to make it a little bit easier to trim off the excess on them. So that doesn't look too sloppy. And then just for a little bit of flair, to make it look like the paper's been written on, let's actually make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to save that as a PNG. Logo for tech writing. Now, one more thing that we want to do, because we do want to add letters, and they can be a little bit trickier. We'll make those letters blue. Kind of a, not too bright blue, but a blue. For those, and this is going to seem a little weird until you actually see it in action, we'll just make a little blue marble. Alright, so back over in Blender. While we're still in edit mode, go over here, image, open image, and we want to go to desktop where we had that saved. Come down to right there. And now you can see on both sides it has our texture. It doesn't look great yet, but that's what we're doing this for. Go over here, we can kind of put everything into place as we kind of need. Make it like that. And you're not going to want to stretch it out too much without using the size button, because then it will look a little awkward. So given that, we can always come back into this program and make it look a little bit better too. So we bring up this, bring it down a little bit more. Come out here a little bit more. And this doesn't need to look professional as long as it looks good on screen, on the model. So let's see, turn back to black. Tidy up a little bit. And again, we're not trying to make a super complex thing here, so keeping it simple. Come back over to Blender. Hit Control R once the new version has been saved, and see it is going to look a little bit better because we've modified this to look a little bit more like our model. And from there we can kind of fine tune it. This right here, these sets that we kind of ignored before, that where the indentation is, We can select them there, move them around here. This entire row right here needs to be a little bit more. And that's right there is kind of why you don't want to do too much of this, because now these are getting distorted, like especially when you can see it, especially on the lines. But for that, you can always just select these little bits, kind of move them back into position, and it looks just fine. And again, like I said, you can always, now if you go to this right here, to wireframe, or not wireframe, solid. Usually textures for actually seeing the solid is usually a more grayscale version of the model. So let's see, these. Move everything back in position. I'm not going to make it, again, since this is more of a tutorial than anything, I'm not going to make it look too gussied up. But just to kind of give you a general idea of how to make this look a little bit better if you were to make this as a full-on project. Now you can see how it's kind of clipping through here. Every single one of these is going to be playing into this in a different way. So we want to deselect the ones already in the black, or it's already deep into the black, and kind of move them out here. There's still going to be a little bit of clipping right here, and this is the side I believe that we did with the, yeah, there we go, not freehand technique. So it's kind of a little bit simpler to hash out what needs to go where, which part of this is where, stuff like that. Kind of move it away from the white because we want this to be a black, basically a black border. I don't think we need to go that deep, but let's get, yeah. Now you can also change the size on these. It won't change the size on the model itself, but it will change the size over here, which might make it easier to handle. And again, the more ferts that you have, the easier it is to make this look good. So subdivide even more if you really can. See, it's really hard to make something like this look smooth, just because we're not using as many verts as we should. Again, that also being the non-freehand side is making it difficult. This, however, should be a little bit easier to understand. We're going to move this up so it looks like it's pointing right to this. And actually on this, probably should go ahead and just smooth this out because it should be simple. Just this first row right here, probably. Move up. And see, it's going to come closer to that border. You can move it around if you like. I think it looks decent enough, again, for our purposes right now. Here. Move that away. Move that a little bit farther away. And you can kind of see it take a little bit better shape. again, since we left the outside a little bit willy-nilly, the outside of the shield, I should say, a little bit willy-nilly, we can kind of play around with it more. Yeah, just because something like this is going to be a little bit harder to fix with our current level of subdivision, I'm going to leave it looking a little bit rough like this. Again, could do more. But as instructable, you should know what you need to do to fix that. Given that we've been using that to fix everything else on this. Let's see. So, okay, for our purposes, that should be good enough. We've got the pencil back into position. And we're going to want to right-click on that one to select that, as I said, right up here in our layer. And since we've already done this, all we have to do is switch back with this to our logo and rotate this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it thin, because we're using pretty simple colors. We're not using something too complex. So we can just make it, we don't even need to make it fit the shape. You just need to make it fit to where it looks proper. Looks a lot like a pencil, don't it? And obviously you could put like a little bit of words here, like the number 2, stuff like that. Make it look a little more gussied up. But as you see, something like that's going to be a lot more simple than this part right here. But this is the part where you could be working on it for a long time, just to make it look great. Which again is kind of outside of the scope of what we're doing here. Now, since this, you can see that since this is a double-sided thing, doing the UV from, where was that? The UV from view. This being flat, it's going to show both sides. So that's why we have this here. If you really want to, you could select just this back side and make it its own UV and make something different on it. Again, a little bit out of our scope, but just to kind of show you this too, that's going to look a little bit more in line, but you can see where it makes the squiggle look a little worse. So there's a lot of things you can do to play with it to make it look a little bit better. Just in general, that's where we want to be. So what we're going to do now, we're going to add text. And the text is going to show up like that, just like the meshes did. We want to rotate it until it looks decent. So it kind of lines up. And gonna make this a little bit smaller so we can work this a little better. We hit tab, or we can just go over here to edit mode. We're going to make it say Tech Writing Team. Now we can keep it that length if we want to make it look like this. And just like anything else, we can size it. So if we want to look more like this, again. And what we're going to want to do, if we want to make it 3D, then we go over here, and this is where we're going to do a lot of the editing. We want it to be 3D, so extrude it. Just to give it some texture. Probably want to bevel it just a little bit. Maybe, let's see, go like this. You can play around with these just to make it look a little bit nicer, a little less nicer. Change the font as we need, stuff like that. And then what we do is object, convert to mesh. And that's going to turn this into a 3D object as well. From there we can edit it just as we could anything else. But for this, again, just to show you what it looks like, unwrap. It's going to look like a mess. Fortunately for this, it doesn't really matter, because what we're going to want to do is just make the text blue. And because we beveled it, it's going to look a lot better than if we didn't, where it would just kind of be a big blue mass of kind of unreadable text. So, that being said, that should be more or less the last part of our tutorial here. Again, we can kind of play around with this to make it look a little bit better. And obviously, if we were doing this for a professional job, then we really want to take the time to make it look perfect. But again, since we kind of didn't really set ourselves up to, it's something that's going to be a little bit farther beyond the scope of what we're doing here. And you can really play around with the size over here on the UV map a lot. Because if you get something a little bit too close together, or make it look weird, you can always select from here and edit it over here as well. But again, you always want to be mindful of what each little bit is going to do to every other little bit, like how the this right here looks a little off center. Not too hard to fix in this case, it shouldn't be. But that's generally about what you would do in order to make a 3D logo. Hope this helps. If nothing else, it's something you could do for fun. Or if you're starting your own business, maybe play around with it a little bit and make a logo of your own. So what I like to do file, and then save. Tech Writing Team logo. And there you go. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.